we'll get started. So again, for the recording, welcome to the webinar on the 2nd of August, 2023, Australian visas. Today, we're going to run through a few different things, but first I'll just introduce myself. I am Rachel. I am an immigration lawyer and I own Passage Migration Consulting. And I also have a second business, which is called Passage Co. So the two of those businesses together essentially offer an all-inclusive service for migrants looking to find work in Australia. We partner individuals with organisations in Australia that are facing a skills shortage and help those individuals with their visas, and then assist in that onboarding process as well. So my experience has been as a lawyer, but as a result of that experience, the Passage Co side of things has also come around. So as you can see by that tinsel wall in the background, I am not your average lawyer, but certainly one that is doing law a little bit differently, and one that I hope you'll get to know a little bit more through this presentation. So our agenda for today is that we're going to go through the skilled occupation list. So these are very important when you are thinking about working in Australia, studying in Australia, and finding a visa. We'll also go through a bit of a visa program overview. We'll go through the sponsorship pathways very quickly, and then I'll ask and answer some common questions. So the sponsorship pathways we'll only just touch on, but it's kind of good to know if you're considering having a conversation with a potential employer. So the first part we're going to talk about is do a visa program overview. So the first few visas different sort of categories of visas, where you're looking for a role in Australia, or where you're thinking about getting sponsored or something like this. There is different visa programs that are going to mean different things for you. So for casual work, for low skilled roles, maybe you're on probation or something like this. That might be your student visa holders, work and holiday visa holders, and your graduate visa holders also in that section. For also graduate visas. For the second part there, work experience, postgraduate, or early career. Also your graduate visa holders, and then your training visas. And then short to long-term work, you'd start to look at things like a 400 visa, a TSS, or the subclass 482, which is one and the same thing, or a 494, which is a regional visa. And it wouldn't be a webinar around the time of the Barbie hype without accidentally dropping in a few Barbie pics throughout the webinar. So you're welcome for those little giggles. So a little bit of more in-depth information about each of the visas that I sort of just mentioned. So a subclass 500 visa is a student visa, and that's a student at any level. There used to be lots of different student visas, and it was all very confusing because everyone had a different number depending on the level of schooling they were at. But now it's just one visa, and it's dependent on, what class you're in it's not dependent on which class you're in. The main requirements of that are that you have a confirmation of enrolment, or I guess colloquially known as a COE, and that is issued by the education provider prior to you starting study, and also prior to you lodging a visa. That is something that needs to be in place and is very important to ensure that you can show that you meet the requirements. You must also be able to show that you've got capacity to survive in Australia. So the legislative instrument talks about essentially like a survival amount, and it's somewhere in the vicinity of around $20,000. In addition to that, you also need to be able to pay your school fees and also have money for a return ticket home. And that needs to be shown at the time of application. Generally, how you would do this, a lot of parents will put this money into what's called a term deposit, which essentially means it's a bank account that has a deadline on it that it can only be opened at a certain point. And then that money can that account can sort of be named in the individual's name, or, student fund or something like this. So that's a term deposit. Alternatively, it could just be a bank deposit. Things like property, superannuation, the things that are not, I guess, cash or accessible cash, are a little bit harder to prove the financial capacity, but certainly, if you speak to your migration provider, they'd be able to give you a little bit more of an understanding of that. The next big thing is the overseas student health cover. So that essentially is private health insurance for any student that comes to Australia. That is just standard across the board and is something that's mandatory for the application. And then the final thing is that genuine temporary entrant requirement. So what does that mean? A genuine temporary entrant requirement essentially means that you are genuinely coming to Australia on a temporary basis. Now, that intention might change once you arrive in Australia, and policy does allude to that and does specifically state that the intention may change. But on the time of preparing the student visa and getting your confirmation of enrolment, talking to your education institution, and trying to figure out exactly what your next steps are, you need to be able to say, look, I want to come and study in Australia. This is the reason why I've chosen Australia. This is the reason why I've chosen this institution. This is how this is going to help me in my life in the future, or how it's going to build on what I've already done in my career. And that statement will essentially be submitted, and that's something that needs to be A-okayed by both the education institution and also by the Department of Home Affairs. So they're the main requirements for a 500 visa. The next one is your 485. So essentially the 485 is a graduate visa. The purpose of this is that graduates of Australian qualifications can come to Australia, can stay in Australia and get some work experience. There's two different streams, so post-study work stream or graduate work stream, and the length of the visa will depend on the qualification. So what does that mean? So for someone that's just completed a bachelor, for example, generally you'll get a 2-year length of visa, and that's compared to a master's student that might get a bit longer. And so, and the big requirement on this one is meeting the Australian study requirement. So the Australian study requirement essentially says that you have been studying in Australia for at least 2 academic years, and you have completed a qualification within the last 6 months. If you don't fit within those criteria, it does become quite difficult to be able to try and get a 485, if at all. The post-study work stream or graduate work stream will also be dependent on the skilled occupation list, and also on the on the skilled occupation list, and also the type of qualification that you completed. The subject of the qualification that you completed. My apologies. So dependent on those, it's going to depend on which one you sit in. So meeting the Australian study requirement, and also under the 485, getting an Australian federal police clearance is something that's quite important. So generally the 500 visa, generally you're applying for from offshore. A 485, you usually in Australia. Then we can flip to the working holiday visa. So if you're not intending on coming to Australia to study, which is totally fine, you might be able to apply for a 417 or a 462. Now, effectively, these are the same visa, but they are directed at 2 different parts of the world. The 417 visa and the 462 have different eligible countries for passports. So that's what the difference is. Some countries under the 462 will require special documentation. So, for example, for someone coming from Peru, you might need an additional document from the Peruvian government to confirm that they're essentially okaying you. So some countries will have those additional requirements under the 462. On the 417, things are usually a little bit more straightforward. So you can come to Australia and essentially you can travel around, do what you want to do, and you can also work. Now, the work restriction is that you work for an employer for no more than 6 months per visa. So what that means essentially is that if you came to Australia and started working for ABC, Pty Ltd to do some construction work, and then they wanted you to stay beyond that time, it may be that they might have to sponsor you, or it might be that you would have to kind of come to the end of your first visa and then wait till your second one to be able to continue working for them. If you do lodge a sponsored work visa while you're working for an employer and you need an extension of that 6 months, that is possible. But that is something to consider. So the age limit on this visa, though, is only for people up to 30 years or 35 years for some countries. And there is an ability to get additional years where you've completed regional or specified work. So generally a working holiday visa will only last for a period of 12 months. But if you can go and undertake some regional work, and yes, that is that horrible fruit picking or construction work in the middle of nowhere, or building a solar farm or something like this, if you can go and undertake that work, you may have access to some additional time. So next ones, what else could you get? So if you're not in the student category and you're not in the working holiday category, so perhaps you fall over that age limit, then you might look at one of these options. So the subclass 400 visa is for highly specialized work. It's also short-term and non-ongoing. So, excuse me. So for the 400 visa, essentially you would be someone that has significant amount of work experience in your occupation. I'm just going to take a sip of water, excuse me. You would be someone that has a significant amount of work experience in your occupation. You would be someone that is coming to Australia for short-term work. So maybe it's to do a short project for up to 6 months. It can be in any occupation within reason. So you would need to justify that it's highly specialised. So what that means is that 400 visa doesn't have to be an occupation that's on the skilled occupation list, but you do need to justify why whatever occupation you're putting forward is highly specialised. Further, if you do want that visa to be longer than 3 months, you would need to provide a strong business case as to why you need to be in Australia for more than 3 months. So this visa, while it's not sponsored, it does require the support of an inviting Australian company. So you might find a role in Australia, or you might work offshore for a company that has international operations in Australia, and you're the only person in your company that knows how to do a certain thing. So if you are that person, then you would be eligible for this visa. You might also be someone that's just got some special skills that aren't available in Australia. Maybe that's due to new technology, a new way of doing something in your occupation or your industry, and something that's got, maybe you're the one that's tried and tested. It might also just be that you've got significant amounts of work experience. So significant amount for me is anything 5, 7, 10 and onwards worth of work experience. It might be where you kind of fall into that 400 visa. And importantly, for a 400, there is no age limit. The next one then is the 482 visa. So this is the new look 457. So for anyone that was around many years ago, the 457 was essentially the one that got a bit of bad press. And then it got a brand update to the 482 visa, or the TSS as it's known. So this visa allows occupations that are on the skilled occupation list to be sponsored by eligible employers. Eligible employers are those that already have a sponsorship in place and have that capacity to be able to sponsor individuals. Unfortunately, there's no way of knowing if an employer that you're applying for a job with in Australia is a standard business sponsor, because that information is confidential. However, if generally within a job ad or within a business, if you were to look at LinkedIn and things like this, you can start to get a little bit of a feel for the business's, I guess, thoughts around migration, and if it's something that they'd be willing to support. Some companies within Australia are very willing to support migrants and willing to support migrant workers. And other companies just generally they haven't tried it yet, or they tried it and didn't have a great experience. Or others are just kind of not quite open to the possibility of it just yet. And so while it's not exactly possible to absolutely know, it is worth kind of doing a little bit of a research into employers and finding out whether, what their I guess, appetite for skilled workers would be, where they would need to sponsor. So here, depending on your occupation, you're either going to get a 2-year visa or a 4-year visa. There is no age limit on a TSS, which is good. But you must have a minimum of 2 years work experience. So generally, if you've come to Australia on a student visa, it's unlikely that you're going to jump from a student visa to this one. You might jump from your student visa to your graduate visa to this one, but it's very unlikely, except if you're kind of in a master's or PhD role. You're at a master's or PhD level, you might be able to jump from one to the other. But at this, generally, the 482 is for people that have got at least a minimum of 2 years work experience, usually more. The company has to do Australian labour market testing. Now, there is some changes coming in about that. The UK has been added to the list of countries where you don't need to provide labour market testing. And this is the company's responsibility in any case. But importantly, that is sometimes a bit of a burden on companies, and that's sometimes what puts people off a little bit. But if you get a migration provider, like myself or someone else, to have a chat to a company about what their actual obligations are, generally it makes it a bit of an easier conversation. As an individual, you'll also need to meet English and skills criteria, and there's always a minimum salary of $53,900, which is set to increase, actually. I need to update that slide, everybody. So the minimum salary is actually a little bit higher than that, and I will put that in the text notes of this once this gets posted to YouTube. The same with the next one. The next one is the subclass 494. This is essentially the same as the 482, but it's for regional locations. Now, for anyone that doesn't understand regional locations in Australia, at the moment, everywhere in Australia is regional, pretty much except for Brisbane, Sydney, and Melbourne. Now, that's not every single postcode, but generally Brisbane and surrounds, Sydney and surrounds, Melbourne and surrounds are considered as city centres. But if you kind of get anywhere down to, say, Southport, which is the Gold Coast, that is considered as a regional area. So that is something to consider when you're looking at different options. Now, the reason that you might jump from a 482 to a 494 is that if for some reason your occupation doesn't have availability under a 482, it may have availability under a 494. And if it's available under a 494, that might mean that you could jump down the road to a permanent visa. So keep that in mind. These ones are on list occupations, as I said as well. This also gives you up to 5 years of a visa. You must be under 45 years and have a minimum of 3 years work experience. You also need to meet a skills assessment for this one, and also provide an English test. The company still has to meet the Australian labour market testing requirements, and they need to go and get regional certification. So essentially what that means is that they will need to go to the regional area. There's bodies within a regional area that will provide the certification for these things. And they will write to them and say, look, this is the occupation. This is what we've done to try and find people in this occupation. And we haven't been able to find anyone, so we're now going ahead with this person. Again, the minimum salary needs to be updated, so please ignore that. I will update this before this goes live on YouTube. And that is the 494. So the 400 visa, short-term, highly specialised, very experienced. Subclass 482, either 2 or 4 year visa, minimum of 2 years of work experience. And the subclass 494, minimum of 3 years work experience plus a skills assessment. Both of those, the 482 and the 494, are both under the standard business sponsorship for an employer. So they wouldn't need to get any special sponsorships to do a 494 for a regional option. What else? Okay, so in addition to the ones that we've just talked about, so we've kind of been through the student, the graduate, the work and holiday, and generally the basics of the employer-sponsored visas. Now I just wanted to jump into a few more. So you've got regional visas, regional and independent visas. You've got employer-sponsored permanent residency, so PR means permanent residency. And you've got independent skilled PR or permanent residency. And so what do they mean? So that's a very quick overview of them there, but let's jump in and learn a little bit more. So the subclass 491 or 190 is a state-sponsored regional option, state-sponsored option, which is points tested and provides you with additional points for state nomination. So essentially there's 4 stages. The 4 stages are, as you can sort of see on that screen, the first is to go and get a skills assessment in the relevant occupation. And you also do an English test. Now, yes, anyone that's looking at this that has a passport from an English-speaking country, would I still recommend that you do an English test? 100%. The reason why I recommend that you do an English test, and this goes for anyone, is that if you can get the highest amount of points in an English test, and that's IELTS, say an IELTS score of over 8 in each band, you are automatically getting additional points, like good points for your English. So it's 20 points if you've got an 8 or over in your IELTS. So if you're trying to get good points, then English is definitely a way to go, particularly if you have a passport from an English-speaking country or you've been studying in Australia and your English has been getting better and better. So first things first is that you get your skills assessment and you do your English test. And the reason why you have to do those things first is because if you lodge an expression of interest, which is the EOI, you want to essentially be set up and ready to go with a visa at the time of lodgement of your EOI. Now, why do you want to do that? Because if you get to stage 3 and 4 and you're not ready to proceed to stage 3 and 4 because in stage 2 you fudged the numbers or you attempted to make your resume look better than it was, or you thought you were going to get better on an English test or something. However your EOI looks when you lodge it and whatever points you are claiming at that time is the points that you're going to be tested on when you eventually get to stage 4 and lodging a visa. So if you get to stage 4 and you said you've got 10 years of work experience, but you can only provide evidence for 5 years, then that's going to be a serious problem for you. They will refuse the visa if you can't meet the points test, as you've already outlined to them in the expression of interest. So keep that in mind. People, I guess, get a bit excited and just want to do a skills assessment and lodge an expression of interest. And I want a visa, which is great. But make sure you're prepared. Get prepared to essentially lodge a visa at the time of EOI. Start to get all your work references ready. Make sure that you can provide evidence of payment. Do all of the things that you need to do to get the visa before you lodge that EOI so that you're ready to go. Now, importantly, when you lodge an expression of interest or the EOI, and that's through Skills Select, you don't get a bridging visa. So if you're coming to the end of, say, a student visa or a graduate visa and you lodge an expression of interest and you don't get invited to apply for a visa, you're not going to get a bridging visa to hold you in Australia. So you would need to go and find a different visa to stay in Australia for that kind of period in between. The next step for a state-sponsored one, so the 491 or the 190, and the difference between the 491 and the 190 is the 491 is temporary and the 190 is a permanent visa. Now, obviously, if you can try and get the 190, that's a better outcome if you're looking at permanent residency in Australia. But if you're happy to kind of be on the 491 and then work towards permanent residency in a regional area, that will also work for you as well. When you're lodging an expression of interest, you can tick as many boxes as you want as to the type of visa that you would like to be considered for. So if you're happy to try and do the 2-stage process of 491 to permanent residency, or if you just want to do the 190 straight up, you can choose either the 491 or the 190 on the Skills Select expression of interest form. So the next step will then be that you're invited by a state or territory to essentially meet their requirements. Because it's state-sponsored, there is different states and territories, obviously, across Australia, and each of those has different requirements. Some of them may have the requirement that you are residing and working in that state, unless you're an offshore applicant. Keep that in mind, that this might make you come undone. They may also have their own English requirements. So even if for your visa you got 6s across the board and you're happy with that for your points, but the Queensland government requires 7s, and I don't know that. I'm just giving an example. I don't know that for sure. If they need that and you can't meet that, then that may also be an issue for you. So just make sure you know what your state and territory requirements are before you choose a state or territory. Doesn't seem like rocket science, but it is all these good ways of prepare, and you'll be more and more ready as each stage comes up. Once you meet the state or territory requirements and provide the government, the state or territory body with any information that they need, they will then be able to process your application, and essentially then they will say that they support your application, and then that's where you get those additional 5 points. Now, importantly, you can't get to stage 4 without stage 3 being successful, because your visa at this point is relying on state sponsorship. Then you would be invited by the Australian Government or the Australian Department of Home Affairs to be able to lodge a 491 or 190 visa, and that one goes directly to the Department of Home Affairs. So the difference between stage 3 and stage 4 is stage 3 is an application directly with the state or territory government body that deals with migration. Stage 4 is a visa that is directly lodged with the Department of Home Affairs, which is the Australian government. So different bodies. So just keep in mind that if you get to stage 3, you still need to get to stage 4. Okay, so different to the 491 and 190, the subclass 189, while it's still point tested, it is an independent skilled occupation. Independent skilled option. And it deals with occupations on the MLTSSL. What is that? That is the MITSL. So the medium to long-term skill shortage list. They're the occupations that essentially have access to a 4-year visa, employer sponsored. They're also, I guess it's the better list, really, the medium to long-term skill shortage list. It just gives you more opportunity. And we'll jump into that as to why shortly. This one only has 3 stages because you do remove the state sponsorship stage. So you've got your skills assessment and English test. Again, skills assessment's mandatory. English test, I always recommend people just go and do it to get as many points as possible. You lodge your EOI and remember that you don't get a bridging visa. And then once you go into the pool of applicants, you get an invitation to lodge a visa, and then you lodge it. So keep in mind, just because you've lodged an EOI, it does not mean that you're going to get an invitation for any of those visas. So the 491, the 190 or the 189, your application may be outstanding, but it may be the case that the government, the Australian government or the state government is not looking for your occupation at the time. So there is invitation rounds online that you can Google. So if you Google invitation round 189, 190, 491, you will be able to see, excuse me, I'm just going to grab some more water. You will be able to see the invitations that have gone out in the past and the invitations that for which occupations have gone out as well. And you'll be able to also see the level of points. So if you look back at some of the invitations just post-COVID, when this program was reopening after it had a bit of a significant lull, some of the points were over 100 that they were expecting. It's now gone back to kind of a normal basic level of points. The legislative requirement on points is at least 65, and that's the minimum. Obviously, anything over and above that puts you ahead of the people you're essentially competing with in this pool of applicants. So I would recommend people go and look at those invitation rounds to try and get their head around it. So I guess the takeaway from the subclass 491, 190, 189 is that lodging that expression of interest does not give you a bridging visa. So if you are coming to the end of a visa, then it's possible that it may be the case that you need to start thinking about other options if you've lodged an expression of interest and not yet been invited. Okay, so that's separate to the points tested one. Now we'll move on to the subclass 186, which is employer sponsored permanent residency under the employer nomination scheme. So that's a subclass 186 ENS, and there's 2 streams. So the first stream is the temporary residence transition stream. And that says that if you've been with the same employer for 3 years in the same occupation, in an occupation on the medium to long term skill shortage list, unless a COVID exemption applies, then you may have access to a temporary residence transition stream 186 visa. There is an age limit of 45 on this visa, but there is also an age exemption for people that are earning over the Fair Work High Income threshold for at least 4 years. With that one, so there has been a bit of change around that particular stream as a result of COVID. If you were in Australia during the COVID period, and there is some specific dates that I don't have it off the top of my head, and again, I'll put them down below in the notes, that if you were in Australia during COVID and you were working as the holder of a 482 or an old 457, it may be the case that you would be exempt from having to meet the fact of being on the medium to long-term skills shortage list. It may be that if you had an occupation on the short-term skilled occupation list, it may be that you can still apply for this visa. That's not to say that though, that anyone that has an occupation on the short-term skilled occupation list may have access to this visa. At the moment, you do not, although the government has put something out in the big announcements, or the announcements that were sort of coming out when the review of the migration system report was released a few months back, which essentially saying that anyone on a temporary work visa in Australia will have access to some form of permanent visa by the end of 2023. Now, there is no particular pathway set yet for those people, but keep in mind that, you know, all is not lost. The alternative for the subclass 186 is the direct entry stream, and that requires that you have a skills assessment and at least 3 years work experience in your occupation, or there might be a skills exemption for your particular occupation, for example, for a university lecturer. Now, both of these streams require an employer to sponsor you. That's why they are under the employer nomination scheme. So that is an employer that is generally, the employer is supporting you on a subclass 482. And now they're willing to essentially move you over to the 186. Excuse me. If in some cases an employer might be willing to go straight to the direct entry stream, particularly if you've already gone out and done your skills assessment, it may be the case that some employers wouldn't be willing to do that. It really just depends on the employer that you have. As I kind of mentioned earlier, there's generally a few categories. People love supporting migrant workers, and because they know there's a lot of benefit. 2, people have kind of been burned by the idea and it hasn't really worked out. And then group 3 is that they haven't really thought about it as an option yet. So again, the subclass 491, 190, state-sponsored, but independent, so you don't need an employer sponsor. They are points tested, both of those. The subclass 189 is also points tested, also independent, but does not require state sponsorship. All of those 3 visas, you do have a minimum of 65 points required, and they all need a skills assessment, and I will always recommend that you try and get the highest of English across either of them. Then the subclass 186, which is the employer nomination scheme, so it is an employer-sponsored permanent visa. You've got your temporary residence transition stream and your direct entry stream. All right, let's keep going. Now, I want to talk about the skilled occupation list, because I feel as if what happens is people come to Australia and they study certain things, or they have dreams of leaving their country and coming to Australia and being sponsored and working and all of these things. But unfortunately, what they do is not on the skilled occupation list in Australia, or it's on a list that is not necessarily going to get them to where they want to go. So knowing a little bit of information about the skilled occupation list before you come to Australia, before you start studying, or before you attempt to create your migration goals in Australia is very important. So let's talk about it. The skilled occupation list will indicate if a visa is possible for your occupation, may determine the length of your visa, and will decide if you have access to a permanent visa in Australia. So I think it's really important that based on those 3 things, you know where your occupation sits within the skilled occupation list. So back in 2018, the 457 visa program was scrapped by the government, and a new one was brought in. Now, why is that relevant for everyone? Well, it's relevant because at that time, the skilled occupation list used to be one single list. Now the skilled occupation list is 3 different lists. That means 3 different things. And if that's not confusing enough, within those 3 different things, there is different requirements, and it may or may not change. So good news. So how do you determine then as an individual, how do you go about this, and how do you try and figure this out for yourself? The first thing that I would recommend, and we'll get back to the slide in a sec. The first thing I would recommend is that if you Google skilled occupation list, Department of Home Affairs, there will be a page that pops up that has the skilled occupation list, and it is the online version. This is the best place for you to go to check what visas are available for your occupation. If you scroll halfway down the page, there will be a search bar. In that search bar, you can write marketing specialist, construction project manager, civil engineer, office manager, whatever you want to be when you grow up, you can put in that box and you can have a look at the visas that are available. Now, when you're looking at the visas that are available, you will start to see the numbers of the visas that have popped up throughout this presentation, and you'll be able to understand a little bit more about what that actually means for you. You will also find that next to each of you'll have the page will look something like this. It will say the name of the occupation. It will give you a 6-digit code, and that is an ANSCO code. The ANSCO code essentially means the number from the occupation dictionary that associates with that. That is important because if you click on that number, it will tell you all the skills and experience that that person needs to have to prove that they can work in that job. The next column shows you all of the visa types. The one after that then will tell you which occupation list that occupation is on. So the 3 lists that are going to be available in that column are the medium to long-term skill shortage list, the short-term skill shortage list, and the regional occupation list. So the Mitzel, the Schnitzel, and the Roll. For anyone that hasn't seen my video on the skilled occupation list, there is another one on the YouTube channel that might be helpful for you, specifically talking about the occupation list. Now, this slide is an example only because this does not take into account every single visa. This is TSS visa specific. So for the purposes of a sponsored temporary work visa, which a lot of people come to Australia on or stay in Australia on, the medium to long-term skills shortage list will give you access to a visa for up to 4 years and access to employer-sponsored PR. It will also give you access usually to a 189 visa, which we discussed earlier. The short-term skills shortage list will give you access to 1 2-year visa plus 1 more 2-year visa in Australia. But there's no employer-sponsored permanent residency, but this is more likely to give you access to a 491 and a 190. The regional occupation list, you're only allowed to work in a regional area and you can do that for up to 4 years. There's no specific PR if you were to get a TSS in a regional occupation list. However, if you were to get a subclass 494, which we remember is the regional version of the TSS, you may have access to a permanent visa. So 3 different lists mean 3 different things and have access to many, many different visas. So it's worth finding out from that page. Again, if you Google skilled occupation list, Department of Home Affairs, you'll be able to see, okay, which of these is going to be best for me and start to investigate the visas a little bit more. This should come into play when you are thinking about what to study in Australia, what to study offshore, even when you're thinking about moving to Australia at some time in the future, and also what to get work experience in while you're on things like a graduate visa or a student visa or a working holiday visa when you don't necessarily need to be tied to an occupation. Now I'll keep on flicking right through. So I'll go to sponsorship in a second, but essentially not all visas are tied to an occupation. A student visa, a graduate visa, and a working holiday visa, they're all sort of occupation free. Everything else is really going to be tied to an occupation. I should caveat that by saying some of the graduate visas you might need to be specifically working in an occupation, but not only one of the streams. So lots of information there, lots of different visas to consider and lots of occupation lists, but I cannot sort of stress enough to understand where you sit on the skilled occupation list, because that will help you guide your next steps to meet your migration goals. Okay, next thing. When you're thinking about getting sponsored or hoping that someone's going to sponsor you, you might be able to have a better conversation with them if you have a little bit of an understanding. So how do sponsors sponsor? So firstly, they need to either have a commitment to something they already do, or it's a commitment to something new. For companies, as you can imagine. The second thing is that they might have a standard business sponsorship, which is what's going to allow them to sponsor a 482 or a 494. The third thing they might have is a labour agreement. So a labour agreement is essentially similar to a standard business sponsorship, but it's for occupations that don't fall on the skilled occupation list. This might be if someone works in aged care, for example. There is a new aged care labour agreement that has come out. And then the other fourth and final option is that you will find that employers are still willing to sponsor you even if you have a visa, particularly in casual work or high turnover work, hospitality, fruit picking, all of these types of things, customer service, these types of things. As long as you know what your visa conditions are and you can walk into an employer and say, yeah, I'm allowed to work 48 hours a fortnight, or I'm allowed to work full-time now because of this, then you can give them a little bit peace of mind that you know what you're doing as well. Don't always rely on the employer to tell you what you can and can't do. So they're the ways. Look, an employer is going to either seek advice from a lawyer or a migration agent to be able to get this information. But if you can kind of go to them armed, once you've had a check on your skilled occupation, you know what visas you're eligible for and you know which ones you need sponsorship for, you've got a little bit more information there then to go to an employer and say, hey, I think that I could potentially get a 482 because I am a carpenter and a carpenter requires this much work experience and I have that. And so if you're willing to sponsor me, I'd love, for that to happen. Now, similarly, you work in aged care and you're aged or disabled care worker and you are looking to be sponsored. You can say to your employer, look, I understand that there is a new aged care labour agreement out, and this might help you to be able to sponsor people in Australia. I know it might take a bit of time, so it might be something you'd like to consider if, the workforce is struggling a bit. Now, these conversations are not going to be fun or easy, and generally it's going to cost the employer quite a bit of money to be able to sponsor you because it is generally their obligation to pay for most parts of things, except for in certain circumstances. So they don't have to pay for anything to do with the actual visa application, but the nomination and sponsorship they do need to support and pay for. So keep that in mind. So there are 4 ways. So they need to commit to something new, which is a bit scary. They have a standard business sponsorship or labour agreement, or they're willing to employ people without sponsoring. All right. So a few common questions that you might have. How long is it going to take? How long is a piece of string? No, it's not that bad anymore. So post-COVID, we had some terrible processing times. It was all a bit scary. Things were taking way too long. But now they are not. Generally 3 months for a work visa. Students or grads might be shorter. They also might be slightly longer depending on your situation. Off-list occupations will also be longer, especially if an employer still needs to go and get that labour agreement. So generally that's how long it's going to take. Students or grads, if you're in Australia, it could take a bit longer. That's what I've sort of seen. Otherwise, students, the last one I saw that came back was about a month, which was quite good. Excuse me. There we go. All right. How much will it cost? Again, this is just a cost for a TSS. And this is all inclusive, and this includes fees that also an employer should be spotting or paying for you. This might be the total cost though. For a student visa, it could cost you, generally, if you pay a lawyer or migration agent, it's probably going to cost you a couple of $1,000s. And that's in addition to your school fees, your flights, getting your COE, paying for your health insurance. For a graduate visa, again, fees are probably about $2,000. To pay a lawyer, you've got to pay your government lodgement fee. You've got to get your Australian police clearance. You've got to make sure all your documents are in order. So there is definitely bits and pieces that you can do yourself. But if you're worried about cost, you can also just do free consultations, at least with a lawyer or a migration agent, just to make sure you are on the right track. What if it doesn't work out? If it doesn't work out, you quit your job and find a new one. Or, worst case is you know what your obligations are and you know what your employer's obligations are. You also know what your rights are. You can go home, even if it's on a temporary basis. You can become a dependent on your partner's visa. You find an Australian partner. So importantly, I think if it doesn't work out, start to think of the alternatives. It does become quite stressful if things are not working out. I have spoken to a couple of people, particularly students. They're in situations where they've come to the end of their studies and they're not really sure what to do. My big advice is just to try and plan ahead and know what your alternative or your backup option is. It is your responsibility living in a country where you require a visa to understand what your visa conditions are, and understand exactly when your visa is going to expire. It never ceases to amaze me when someone will call me and say, my visa expires next week. And I was like, that doesn't sound good for you. That is not anyone else's problem but yours. If you don't know when your visa expires, you should go and find out right now. Put it in your diary, put a reminder in there a month before and start to think about what your visa options are, particularly if you've got family living in Australia. If you find an Australian partner, that's also a great option. You might be able to do a partner visa. If you have dependents in Australia and you're on separate visas, you may be able to join together. You just need to be a little bit strategic on, I guess, what the best option is going to be based on your circumstances and that of your family if you have one in Australia. But ultimately, what if it does work out? What if you end up living in Australia, you end up becoming an Australian citizen, and you end up loving life here? So ultimately, I think, if you remain positive, you've already made the journey to Australia, you've already relocated, you've already done essentially the hardest part. If a little bit of planning and a little bit of forethought is all you need to do now to make sure you have a better time in Australia, a better journey, and a more better prepared and secure for your future, then I think that you can 100% do that. All right. Now, I just wanted to throw this in there is that if you do end up working with a lawyer, there are a few things that you should consider. So the first thing is to set your intentions for what you would like to do in Australia. Now, if you come to me and you are, I don't know, a farmer in the middle of India somewhere, and you want to come to me and say, Rachel, I want Australian citizenship, then I might have a few follow-up questions as to exactly how we're going to go about doing that. Just because you have an intention of becoming an Australian citizen, it does not mean it's going to happen tomorrow. So that's where rule number 2 comes in, and that is to be flexible. If you are flexible and you understand that, coming from farming and then going into agriculture and then end up being, in a certain role in Australia, that might take some time. So if you be flexible and understand that things might take time, then you will ultimately have a better outcome. Number 3 is to get your documents in order. Now, if you're applying for a student visa, there are requirements that you must provide certain documents. Get them done before you apply for your visa. Don't wait until you apply. Don't wait till you go see an education institution. Get ready. You need to be the one to get ready. It is your responsibility. Similarly, if you're applying for a work visa, you need to get work references. That is very important. You need to make sure your passport is up to date. You need to know when your visa expires. You need to make sure your resume remains up to date for the duration of being in Australia. You also need to know what your responsibilities are. So if you've got a lawyer or someone that you're working with to help you with the visa application, know what it exactly is that you have to do and what they have to do. So you're going to have to go and do things like sit your own English test, for example, or book your own medicals. But a lawyer is going to be the one preparing the forms and helping you get documents and giving you instructions along the way and drafting things for you and just, I guess, being on your team and making you feel safe and aware of what's going on the whole time. And the final thing is to work as a team. And this is either with the people in your visa application or also with your lawyer. If you're working as a team, it definitely makes it a hell of a lot easier. What does that mean? Essentially, that means if there is some strange piece of information that you need to tell someone, your lawyer is the person that you need to tell. If you're in a relationship, then it is a two-sided thing. So both of you need to be contributing to the visa application. So just consider those things when you are coming to a lawyer. Set your intentions, but be flexible. Get your documents in order, know what your responsibilities are, and work as a team with your lawyer and the other people in your visa application. What else? I also just wanted to dump in some resources here. So these things are going to essentially help you. So if you click on each of these, I'll send this pack out. If you click on each of these, they are links to videos. So they might be things that might be able to help you, videos or other links to different places. And what are your next steps? So this is a good thought to start having. Where are you going to go from here? What are your next steps? Use this as a bit of a prompt to make sure that you're getting properly prepared for your situation. And then let's get started. So if you do want to book in a free 15-minute consultation with me, all the consultations are with me. I am the director of the law firm. So you are getting over 10 years worth of work experience to be able to have a conversation with me. Generally, I either figure it out in 15 minutes and tell you what you need to do. You will either then get me to help you or you will go ahead and do it yourself. If I can't figure it out in 15 minutes, generally that's when things are getting a bit curly. I will let you know and I will recommend a advice option which might be better for you. Alternatively, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, to our newsletter via the website. We would love for you to follow us, also on Diary of a Migration Lawyer, and be part of the Passage Migration Consulting journey. I also mentioned that I would give a little bit of a shout out to the other company that I own, and that is Passage Co. Passage Co is an international recruitment firm. Essentially what we do is we find humans to be able to fill jobs in Australia. The difference with us is that we find humans that are not from Australia. Those people might generally need a visa to work in Australia, and they are in highly skilled occupations. And so if you or anyone else you know might fall into that boat, please hit us up at passageco.com.au and send through an inquiry. Otherwise, hello@passageco.com.au there, the email. Very happy for you to send me anything there as well. All right, that wraps us up for right now. Thank you all for attending. I really appreciate it.